Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reinforce. So, I'm Dennis Rothmel, Senior Product Manager from AWS Directory Services. And with me today, I have Jeremy Gervin, Solution Architect from AWS. And we're here to talk to you about deploying and securing Active Directory with AWS Managed Microsoft AD. So, let's talk about deploying. A little bit of backstory. Windows Server 2000 gave us Active Directory, and deploying Active Directory back then looked a little bit like this. You worked with procurement, legal, etc., to get yourself a license, and then you got something in the mail that looked like this. And probably in parallel to that, you did a lot of calculators. You figured out how many servers you need, where you needed to get them around the world, all your network connectivity, and then you had something like this, at which point you could finally start installing and configuring Active Directory. And that process was, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, and then you finally got started. So thankfully, things have changed since then. And nowadays, with just a couple of pieces of information through your favorite cloud services, you can have a fully managed Active Directory deployed for you in minutes. And additionally, if you want to go the route of extending your existing Active Directory, you can, with just a couple of clicks, have Windows servers built in the cloud and then quickly promote them to be domain controllers. So that was then. And now you have an Active Directory. So what are you going to use it for? Well, typically, Active Directory was the de facto solution for workforce identity for many, many years. And so, what you have here is within your corporate network and your private IP ranges, you have an identity solution that suits your workforce and your human identity needs. So, I'm Dennis, and I work for Amazon, and I have a user account that was created for me. I'm a member of many groups, and then those groups are all attached to servers and resources and applications that help me get through my daily life. So in these types of Active Directories, you deploy them within your network, you'd connect them across your WAN link, get many sites up and running, and you'd have kind of tens, hundreds, maybe millions of users available to you in Active Directory. Now, some customers that have had a lot of success with the scalability of Active Directory then turned and said, Active Directory works great, gives me good, identity solution for my workforce. Why not turn around and extend that for my custom applications? So whether you're building an application that's used completely internally, or you build another application that maybe works B2B between you and another business, or between you as your business and your customers, these applications can then use Active Directory as part of the application stack to handle all the authentication needs, identity storage, and permissions management. And so some customers went down that route and have had a lot of success with that and the scalability built into Active Directory. Now, what do these two things have in mind? They both sit comfortably behind the firewall in private IP ranges and are kind of only exposed to the internet via the components that actually need to be there. And that worked really well for many years. So why change anything? Well, there's been needs to modernize and migrate that have been driven by a couple of factors, right? One of the big ones is kind of developments and advancements in technology and security. So things like leveraging identity as the new security perimeter instead of your firewall and instead of your internal network have caused people to push away from Active Directory or at least figure out how to move it into the cloud. And additionally, like as we've all probably experienced over the last couple of years, the work from anywhere initiatives that have come into play have really kind of stunted the growth of Active Directory dependent workloads with their reliance on being required to be inside of your IPv4 internal private networks. And then additionally, business agility and innovation needs have pushed us to kind of figure out how to grow faster, save more money, and then use new tools that are only available in the cloud to innovate and grow quickly. So customers say, well, what do I do with my AD dependent workloads now that I want to achieve all these goals and I want to adopt cloud services? Well, one of the two patterns that customers typically do is they'll do lift and shift. I need to get out of my data center quickly. I need to get into the cloud and be able to benefit from all the scalability and availability that I get there. And so this is deploying like for like. This is the virtual machines that you currently host and then moving them to services like Amazon EC2. This is the storage appliances that you currently use and moving them to services like S3, for example. And then in addition, some customers will say, you know what, I'm going to skip that step. I want to modernize directly into the cloud. And maybe you just take your first step and say, I'm going to go from self managed, fully hosted on my side, to at least a managed service in the cloud. So that would be something like taking your SQL server and the databases that are in it and moving them to a managed service like RDS from Microsoft SQL Server or Amazon Aurora. So that way you can at least get out of the business of managing the infrastructure as you've moved it to the cloud. So, how does AWS help me with this? Well, AWS Directory Service provides two capabilities that I want to talk to you about today. The first one is AD Connector, and that is what it sounds like. It's a connector. It's a directory gateway or proxy that you're able to take your existing Active Directory and use AD Connector to bridge that into assigning permissions in the cloud. So if you think of it this way, it's not doing any replication or caching of your directory into the cloud. It's simply when you need to authenticate to a service, it'll go and connect to your on-premise Active Directory and authenticate you, and then go and provide you the access you need in the cloud. So what you can do here is with your AD accounts, bring them to AWS. So you can plug them in and use your AD accounts for things like the management console access or AWS applications like QuickSight, for example. So if you're doing big data things and you need to do QuickSight in the cloud, you can do that using your AD credentials. The thing to remember here about AD Connector is, yes, it's hosted in AWS, and then it will need connectivity back to your on-premise or self-managed AD. So that'll be in the form of a service account and password, as well as network connectivity. And this is one connector to one Active Directory in one AWS account. So if you need to have connectivity in another account, you would then need to, deploy another connector. So on the other hand, on the other side of the fence, we have AWS Managed Microsoft AD. And that is kind of a fully managed Active Directory in the cloud provided to you by AWS. So think of it as like standalone AD as a service. It integrates with the AWS applications and services like QuickSight, like Workspaces, WorkDocs, etc. It can also connect to on-premise through things like trust relationships and network connectivity, and we'll talk about that quite a bit more. And then also, AWS handles the operations for you automatically. So what that means is no more patching, no more, managing of scale in, scale out, etc. So let's dive in a little bit more about what is managed AD for you. So when you deploy managed AD, you get a single tenant experience, right? So it's a single forest, single domain, just for you, not shared with anyone else. It's deployed into two VPCs across two availability zones at minimum, and then you can connect all of your AD aware workloads via these VPCs. So if you look at the diagram on the right, for example, what happens is as part of the managed AD, we deploy two domain controllers for you, right? These are actual Microsoft Windows domain controllers. We deploy and manage them for you. And then on your side of the fence, there's two ENIs or network adapters that sit in your VPCs that are connected to these domain controllers. So when you go to deploy EC2 Windows instances, or even just connect back to your on-premise with Direct Connect, you'll be able to connect to them via those ENIs, and that's fully routable as you'd expect. Managed Microsoft AD supports multiple AZs as well as multiple regions. And by default, you get two domain controllers, but you can choose to scale out to both additional domain controllers and more regions. I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. So when you deploy managed AD, AWS is responsible for building the servers. We're responsible for replacing them if they ever go unhealthy. So we do all the monitoring for you. If there's a server issue, we either repair or replace it, and it's all handled for you automatically. We take care of all the patching, all the monitoring, and we also do automated snapshots for you, right? So by default, we do like 5 rolling snapshots. You always have the last 5 days worth of your directory snapshotted, and manually you can take additional snapshots at certain points of time as well. So if you're making a big change in your directory, you can grab a snapshot that'll stay there as long as you keep it. So we handle all that stuff for you in the back end, right? We do all the Windows backup and restore and all that work. So then you as the customer just simply benefit from having a directory. You go in and you create users, create groups, create OUs, set delegation, things like that. You can create GPOs with any configuration you want, and go ahead and deploy it, right? So things like password policies, fine-grained password policies for your OU structure, you can go ahead and set that up. And then additionally, some of the things that like require elevated rights to the directory or direct access to the domain controller, we've kind of provided them all to you through our AWS console and CLI. So things like creating trust relationships or even extending the schema can all be done automatically for you just by you specifying or setting your desired configuration, and we go off and do the work for you. So let me talk to you about what are your deployment options for Managed Microsoft AD. So if you're new to Managed AD, I highly recommend you start with the console. It just kind of guides you through everything. We don't ask a lot of questions when you create a directory. We take care of a lot of the work for you, but the console experience makes it very straightforward, right? You open up the console, you select an edition. We have standard and we have enterprise. And then you provide a DNS name. You can also provide a NetBIOS name optionally if you like, or we'll pre-create it for you. You put in a password and then you hit next. On the next page, you're going to get a list of VPCs you can select from or create a new one. And then a couple of subnets that you can select. And then after that, you just hit deploy and we go off and we build a directory for you. So That's the simple route. And then once you've gotten comfortable with that experience through the console, it's then very easy to turn around and extend that into being, programmatic or declarative in the way you deploy your infrastructure. So in the center, you'll see like we support CloudFormation. We also support Terraform and CDK. And so what that lets you do is say, I have an AD dependent workload and it needs a couple of VPCs and some domain controllers, as well as some EC2 servers to put the application on, and RDS SQL servers to put the SQL database on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can go and declare that entire infrastructure stack as a Terraform or a CloudFormation template and go and deploy it all automatically, right? And those EC2s can automatically join the domain after it's built, and same thing with the RDS instances, et cetera. So it really does put the power back in your hands to state how your infrastructure needs to be and just have it deployed for you automatically. So let me talk to you about patterns of how customers typically deploy managed AD. And I'll give you some good like kind of use case examples to go with each one. So the first one is managed AD with a trust. So a lot of folks here probably have had Active Directory in their environment for even as long as 2 decades, right? And so what's the value of the additional AD that you would deploy in the cloud? Well, with managed AD in the cloud, you can then go ahead and kind of connect it to Amazon first party applications like RDS, like EC2, and have that stuff all deployed automatically in a resource forest, and then connect back to your on premise or self managed AD. So that way, your users and groups that everyone already logs into their laptops with have transparent access to the applications or databases that you've deployed in the cloud. So this is the classic example of I'm doing a database migration. I'm going to run my databases in a cloud. Those databases and applications need an AD that sits in AWS and is highly resilient. And I'm not worried about any network connectivity blips between my on premise and the cloud. And then that's all kind of handled on one side of the fence. But all of my users can still connect directly through that application or database. So the next one is AD connector. So typically I see customers start out with an AD connector connected to their managed data or so to their AD on premise, and they'll go and use this to deploy things like workspaces. So that way you can start to become familiar with the AWS ecosystem and you don't have to deploy a secondary domain in the cloud, but you can still use your existing AD service principles and security principles from day one. Next up, we have fully standalone managed AD. So like I said, managed AD is a standalone directory in the cloud. It's a new forest, single domain, and by default, it's not connected to anything. So a classic example of why would I do this is maybe I have outsourced or kind of isolated unit in my business that needs infrastructure quickly. So the example I've seen customers deploy is managed AD with Amazon Connect for a call center application, and then workspaces for the desktop for the call center users. You get an entire business in a box. You can deploy the whole thing through Terraform, through CloudFormation, and it's really quick and easy, isolated from the rest of your business, or it can be connected. But you get that kind of everything runs in the cloud, and I kind of don't have to manage any of the bits underneath. The fourth option here I have is just extending your existing AD with Amazon EC2 and then letting it replicate. So this would be, I have AD and I, have Direct Connect in place and it's connected to some VPCs. And now I just want to take my domain controllers and put some of them in Amazon. So that way, if I ever have a connectivity issue or some kind of issue with my domain controllers on premise, there's still a couple sitting in Amazon, the AWS that are being taken care of by Amazon. And then lastly, a combination of all of the above. And this is actually pretty common for customers that are highly dependent on Active Directory. Taking your existing domain and extending it into AWS with EC2 provides you with a local copy of your database that's available in whatever regions you deploy it in and is highly resilient to fault. But then in addition to that, a managed AD with a trust then can take all of your workloads that are kind of the managed applications like RDS and have them all kind of operating in an isolated environment that is kind of limiting your blast radius or susceptibility to kind of any issues there. So these are common combinations of deployments that you can see customers doing when they have a lot of reliance on Active Directory. So let me talk to you about a couple more things now that we have managed AD and we kind of have some ideas of how we want to deploy it. Let me talk about multi-region extension first. So this is available for Enterprise Edition directories. And what this does is you select the region that you want to be in, that you want to extend your existing directory to. You'll go and do the same thing. Which VPC, which subnets do you want it to be in? And click next. And we'll do the same work that we did like when we created a directory, right? We will build additional domain controllers in those regions. Then we'll go and connect back to the other domain controllers and replicate all that data apart. This is part of your standard DC promo process. All that replication occurs kind of on the AWS services side of the network. So anything you change in your VPC doesn't really impact the way replication works. That's all handled on our side of the fence. On your side of the fence, then what you have is those same two ENIs in your VPCs on in that other region. So, for example, I would have maybe North Virginia as my first region, and my second region might be Singapore. Now I have a local copy of that AD database in Singapore, and my applications can access that database locally. So, no more kind of cross-region calls or any of that kind of stuff to be concerned about. Change notification is enabled on replication, so that takes the kind of standard quote unquote 15 minutes of replication down to seconds. So you get quite high speed replication, and that all happens on the AWS backbone, so it's pretty quick. And then the last bit you might want to know, while this is a managed service, it's kind of good to know where the FSMA roles might lie in case you need to connect to kind of the FSMA role holder for any reason. And those are always kept in the primary region by default. So just in case you need to know where those are, that's where they're at. Now you have multi-region, and that's all within one AWS account. Well, what about if I want to use multiple AWS accounts, right? So let's follow the standard practice of one application, one account, and then identity is maybe somewhere else, right? So this lets you do that with managed AD sharing, or directory sharing, as we call it. So this is to help you take a single directory and share it with multiple accounts, and we don't deploy additional infrastructure in every account. So it's a very like network connectivity and kind of places the directory available to you. So you go to the directory services console and you can see directories shared with me listed in the console, and then you'll be able to see which ones are there. You can establish kind of more and more VPC connections and do kind of VPC routing, etc. You'll get a basically virtual directory ID in the other account that is then a kind of pointer back to your original account. That kind of way you'll see a different directory ID, but it's the same directory. Um, you can share this within your AWS orgs method. And what you do is you would go to kind of the orgs management account where the managed AD is deployed, and then you can select other accounts from your org tree, and those accounts will automatically then receive managed AD shared at that point. So you still do have to select them, but at that point the work is done. The other account will then see the managed AD and then can start deploying workloads that leverage that directory. Additionally, you can do it via a handshake method with any accounts that are not in your org. So what this would be you'd put in the account ID, hit request. They'll receive a request, and they can go and accept the directory. And once that handshake's complete, now they have access to managed AD, and they can go and leverage that for workloads, etc. Directory sharing is also per region, which then helps you keep all your traffic localized. Now I said a lot, and it sounds maybe a little complicated. Let me give you a diagram to make it simpler. So in the center of this, you'll see this is the AWS account that's holding your managed AD, right? So that is example.com, could be your company name.com. And what you're seeing here on the left and the right side is that there's two different regions. So like I mentioned earlier, right, Northern Virginia and Singapore, for example. These two regions are connected and they replicate kind of on the back end. And then if you look on the left and the right sides, you're seeing kind of an application account. So we'll just stick with the left side for now. So on the left, I've deployed you kind of name your favorite software, PeopleSoft or whatever. And that would be sitting in VPCs, which then have access to the managed AD. And the reason why they see that is because of this directory sharing line kind of across the middle. And so that provides those VPCs connectivity to that managed AD. So then you can go off and deploy all your workloads and then keep all your traffic localized. So now you have managed AD, you've deployed it, and you have lots of methods to deploy it. You understand some, kind of patterns that are pretty common in how to implement this. But now let's talk about that other piece. Let's connect this back to your existing AD so that way you can start assigning access to your workloads. So, Jeremy, why don't you talk to him about it?
Thank you, Dennis. I hope everyone can hear me since this is a silent session. Yeah, I'm Jeremy Gervin. We're going to talk about trust. This is one of the larger hurdles to adoption sometimes, and usually once we talk it through, it ends up not being a hurdle at all, but because there is some misconceptions which we'll touch on later on. But I want to talk about the trust types that are supported by managed AD. You have the forest trust and an external trust. You might hear me say domain trust. Just keep that in mind. If I say domain, I mean external. They're kind of switchable because they're a point, a one-to-one relationship there. With that said, let's go ahead and dive into this. Forest trust. We support forest trusts in a direction of one way or two way, and I'll talk about direction. What that means is who's trusting who. In a one-way trust, that means one side is trusting the other side. And a two-way trust means both sides are trusting each other and authentications can flow both ways. With a one-way, authentication can only flow one way. Um, Transitivity, that means how authentication can flow, especially with a complex forest. I have a diagram which we'll dive into that and actually explain that a little bit more. And the authentication type, supported by Forest Trust is Kerberos and NTLM. NTLM is a legacy protocol. Kerberos is kind of a legacy protocol, but NTLM is even more so, and recommended not to use NTLM if you can avoid it. Kerberos is definitely the much more secure protocol to use. And the big difference you're going to see between the two, at least on this slide, is external/domain trust only support NTLM, but they can work with Kerberos. There's some caveats with it. And we have a link to a blog post that actually explains some of those caveats there. So you can get Kerberos to work with it, but there's the reason it says NTLM, and this is actually pulled from Microsoft's documentation on this. And external trust are not transitive, which basically means it's a one-to-one relationship and authentications can only flow between the domains that are trusted with each other. And I also put Realm Trust in here. Managed AD currently doesn't support this today, but if you have a use case where you want this, we want to hear your feedback on that and see if that's something we should prioritize. So that's why I threw that in there as well. So if you do have a use case, please get with us afterwards and we'd love to hear your opinion on that. So let's talk about transitivity. So to keep it simple, we have a two-way trust here between example.com and corp.local. And in this first scenario, we're going to have we have a two-way trust and it's going to be a forest trust. So what that means is users from example.com could access resources in child.corp.local, or resources in child.corp.local could access resources in example.com. That's transitivity. Basically means it can flow within the forest between the 2 points. Now let's say scenario 2, I only have an external trust between corp.local and example.com. Example.com users can't access resources in the child or tree, and also the child or tree can't access the resources in example.com because domain/external trust is only between those 2 points, and that's it. And another thing to keep in mind, we and Microsoft recommend that you use a forest trust if all possible. Both of us don't recommend using external trust because of the limitations with Kerberos and things like that. So something to keep in mind if you can avoid it at all costs. Speaking of Kerberos, let's dive into Kerberos a little bit. This is a 200 level session. So I'm not going to go into extreme depth on Kerberos, but we could talk about it for quite some time. There is a link at the end of this deck that actually has a link to a blog post that actually walks you in detail through all these different steps. So if you want more details, and it actually has links to where you can get even deeper with Kerberos if you want. But I do want you to understand a few points here. So the very first part, you authenticate, like 1 and 2 on this screen, you're going to see is an authentication. That typically happens when you sign in your Windows box. You get your ticket granting ticket, which basically allows you to get other Kerberos tickets. So the next thing I'm going to do is I want to access this file system in domain B. So what I do is I send a request to my domain A domain controller with the SPN for domain B, a service principal name. And I say, hey, I don't think it's in our realm or domain, and I might need a referral. And the domain controller evaluates it and says, yes, you need a referral. Here's a service ticket for a referral. Go talk to domain B. So I take that referral ticket and then I go talk to domain B and say, hey, I want to access the system. Domain B evaluates it, says, yes, it's a valid ticket. Here you go. Here's your service ticket that you can go send to the FSX system in domain B and access it. So if you understand anything with this process and remember it, all I want you to remember is no passwords are passed between domain A or domain B. Even the authentication from the client onto domain A, no passwords being passed here. And also remember referrals. That's pretty much how Kerberos works across the trust. It is referrals. So in this exact diagram that you see here is actually on the blog post as well. So it is a public diagram that you can easily get online as well. Let's talk about some of the myths I've faced. These are actually conversations I've had with customers on some of these items. I mean, all these items are actually conversations I've had, and I've had to pull up either the public documentation or talk through it and explain it and expand upon the public documentation with customers. Um, Trust synchronized objects between domains. Trust does not synchronize any objects between domains. Yes, there is a trust object on each domain, and there is a password on that trust object. That part is synchronized, but the objects within the domain itself are not synchronized. And the only reason they have to synchronize that password is to allow the domains to communicate with each other. So there is no synchronizing of users and groups from one domain to another over a trust. Now, there's tools that can allow you to do that, but by default, when you create a trust, nothing is synchronized. Another comment I've had is trusts are inherently secure. Um, in and of themselves, trusts do not give additional permissions, especially depending on even a two-way, which is the most permissive of trusts. The most you could do is enumerate objects in the other domain and see objects. But if you have private attributes and things like that in your objects, you won't be able to see them. You'd have to delegate those permissions. Even with the right permissions, they have to be delegated. We kind of touched on this with Kerberos, but I just want to hammer it home because I've had many conversations on this. Passwords are not passed across the trust. Um, it doesn't happen. You don't have to worry about someone stealing your password when you do a Kerberos referral or anything like that. Also, one-way trusts are unidirectional. They don't go. It doesn't go both ways. Now there is some, like, I've read some security articles where there's some ways you could hack the trust account and do all that, but it's really exotic and you'd have to have full access on both sides to really do something with it. So it's unidirectional with the one-way trust, and we generally recommend, if you don't need a two-way, and I'll talk about scenarios when we talk about applications here shortly where a two-way is applicable and a one-way is applicable. If you only need a one-way, just do a one-way. No need to do a two-way unless it's absolutely needed. Um, and I kind of touched on this already. Users are not granted permissions when a trust is created. By default, with a two-way, they can enumerate, but a one-way, they can't enumerate. And what you have to do is type in credentials to enumerate objects in the other domain. And any write operations have to be delegated. You can't, by default, no write operations are allowed. It always has to be delegated. And with that, let's go ahead and talk about application integration. AWS Managed AD integrates with a variety of applications, whether they be AWS or actually self-managed options as well. I have a laundry list of them I'll show you. I'm not going to touch on each of these, but some of these actually reside in the VPC. So like Amazon RDS for SQL Server, or most of the RDS flavors do integrate with Managed AD, and there actually is a resource that resides in your VPC. Same with FSX, Amazon FSX for Windows File System, or FSX for ONTAP as well, integrates with Managed AD. Or you just have standard EC2 instances. You technically could have on-premise resources. As long as there's a network route and you have the proper ports open, you can join machines to a Managed AD from on-premises or other cloud providers if that's your choice. Then we have these other AWS managed applications, whether they be Chime, Amazon Single Sign-On, Workspaces, WorkDocs, all these applications, and they don't have a minus Workspaces, and I'll touch on Workspaces in a moment, but all these in the right-hand column don't actually have a data plane component that talks to the VPC directly, and they talk through the AWS network to the Managed AD to be able to authenticate. So a thing to remember with this, with trust, I want you to go, before I talk about Workspaces, if it's an item that integrates directly with the VPC, like you see RDS and FSX or just standard EC2 instances, more than likely you can get away with just a one-way trust in that scenario. Now, if there's a AWS sign-in page that you're signing into, so like say Workspaces has a sign-in page, Chime has a sign-in page, WorkDocs, whether they be a client or a web page that you sign into, a two-way trust is generally going to be required in those situations. So that's the easy way to figure out whether you need a one-way or a two-way trust. A thing with Workspaces, it still would require a two-way trust, but there is a component of it that does live in the VPC. So you need, the workspace itself does need full access as if it's a Windows client on the network with a Managed AD. So it's not completely isolated like some of these other applications. And this is the long list of applications that are currently supported with Managed AD. This list will change. It is in our public documentation as well. But I just want to show, and it'll grow. I wouldn't be surprised in the future there'd be some new service that gets added to it. So it's constantly growing. It's grown quite a bit over the years from when since I started with Amazon. Um, I just put it here as a reference. The next one I want to talk about is the natively integrated applications. So these will be the ones where you actually just integrate them as if it was just a member server or things like that into your managed AD. And it would be like traditional AD even in that use case. Um, Most applications, as long as it doesn't require domain admin or enterprise admin, should work just fine. Um, that's been my experience. Now, obviously, we haven't tested everything. Uh, the products listed on here, I have personally tested, and they do work with managed AD. A thing to keep in mind with ADFS, you can't use the GUI installer. You actually have to use the command line because you have to point it to a particular container to install it, but it can be installed without enterprise admin or domain admin. But there is some caveats to installing it, but it will actually work. With PKI, it does work. You can deploy Microsoft and the Microsoft Enterprise CA just fine, but there is some limitations with that, and that has to do with Active Directory certificates, certificate web enrollment service and certificate web enrollment policy service. Those two items cannot be installed because they do a blind check to see if you're a member of enterprise admins, and that's something we can't delegate around. So that is why those two features of PKI will not work with managed AD. But other than that, you can deploy PKI, have it issue certificates to the domain controllers to your clients. You could do native smart cards and everything else with it as well if you chose to go that route. And the rest of these just work as they will. A thing to note with System Center, yes, SCC System Center Configuration Manager (SCCM) does require a schema extension, and what you end up having to do ahead of time is take the LDIF file for the schema extension and upload it through our API, and then you can extend the schema to what you need it to be. Then install SCCM, and it works just fine. Let's go ahead and talk about monitoring. We actually have a session, IAM 352, for anomaly detection based on the CloudWatch logs that we allow you to send. So we have this feature called log forwarding, where you can send the Windows security event logs. So these are actually the raw Windows security event logs that can be sent to your CloudWatch logs account in your account. And they're not filtered in any way or form. You're getting the raw logs as they are in the Windows event log. So we highly recommend you turn the service on. It is not on by default because there is a cost to store CloudWatch logs in your account. So we didn't want to just incur charges for you. But yes, we highly recommend you turn it on if possible. We also recommend that you turn on Amazon Simple Notification Service, or SNS, for directory status. So let's say the underlying hardware has a failure with your managed AD and one of the domain controllers goes down and we end up having to rebuild it. The rebuild process takes 20, 30 minutes potentially. And during that time, you do have one domain controller down, but the other one's up, but you're still in this state called impaired state. You'd get notified of that status change through SNS if you have it configured. So it's good to know when you have an impairments, or if for whatever reason, if there was a major issue, you'd be notified of that as well. Beyond that, so that's only affects with status changes of the directory. So we highly recommend you turn on. And granted, yes, there's charges with SNS, but very rarely do statuses do change. So it shouldn't be a high volume type of thing. Also to note, if you have CloudTrail enabled, all directory service APIs are tracked in CloudTrail. So it's the AWS service API. So these would be APIs like create trust, create conditional forwarder, create directory, delete directory, things like that. Now, if we're talking like native Active Directory API calls, let's say you use the Active Directory PowerShell module to create a user or delete a user, those will not be logged in CloudTrail because CloudTrail has no awareness inside what's going on with Active Directory. But those items will be logged in the Windows security event log, which you can view. And you do actually have access to some of the Windows event logs via the MMC. You can actually remotely connect to the domain controllers to view those event logs. So you do have access to the DNS server event log, the DNS server audit event log, the SMB audit event log, and the Windows security event log as well. You have access to those 4 event logs via the MMC. So if you did want to see them, a thing to note with the security logs, since there is a lot of auditing turned on, those logs will roll over quite fast. So that's why we highly recommend you use CloudWatch logs. So you always have those logs, and you can set retention policies and clear them after a period of time to whatever meets your needs there. Um, we also have some additional security recommendations. If you aren't aware, we just recently launched the directory settings feature to where you actually can turn off network protocols and ciphers. So like if you want to turn off RC4 on the network stack, or turn off SSL, well, SSL3 is already turned off by default, but if you want to know for sure that it's turned off, you actually can turn it off or turn it on if you choose to live dangerously there. But you actually do have the ability to do that via the console now, or the APIs. That feature was just launched a couple months ago. Highly recommend you look at that and disable any of these old protocols that you don't need. Like RC4 is enabled by default in Windows. If you no longer need RC4 and all your clients are modern, you probably could disable that and just be fine. But a thing to note, always test before you disable protocols and ciphers, because you could potentially break some of your older clients. Another recommendation is remove domain admin and enterprise admin access from any domain join machine. So I highly recommend that customers set up a group policy that applies to their OU and applies to their computer objects within OU to not allow domain admins / enterprise admins to be able to log into these machines via the access the machine via the network and log in interactively or through remote desktop services. It's not going to happen, but this way you know for sure that no one other than you can access your machines. Also, when managed AD is provisioned, it's provisioned with the admin account is what it's called, and it is named admin. And that account should be treated as a break glass account. It should not be used for regular logins. And a reason for that is when you log in with a shared account like that, it's hard to attribute who did what, especially if multiple people have access to that account. So we highly recommend that everyone with elevated privileges, or every account really, should be unique and independent, and the admin account should be treated as a break glass and only brought out in the cases if, for whatever reason, all the elevated admin accounts, for whatever reason, were locked out in that rare case. But it should just be, have a password set, some random long password, preferably longer than I would do 128 or more characters. That way, because Windows has a limitation with interactive logins where, like, if you can't log in via RDP with a password longer than 127. So I'd do like 128 character password on it, something ridiculously long, and that way it should prevent people from using it when they shouldn't be. Also, we recommend that you use managed service accounts or group managed service accounts wherever possible for your service accounts. Let AD and the member server handle the password changes. Is that way you don't have to manage that, and it's rotated automatically on behalf. Obviously not every application can support that, but if possible, highly recommend you do that. That's supported out of the box with Managed AD. And also, Dennis kind of touched on this as well. Implement fine-grained password policies. The password policy out of the box with Managed AD is the default for Microsoft, which is okay. I mean, the password timeout is default to 42 days, which is a little short, but I'd rather it time out sooner than have it last for a longer period of time. But everyone has different policies as far as that goes. With the fine-grained password policies, you can set all those different policies. And I recommend setting a password to 15 or more characters, simply because when you do that, there isn't an LM hash, a LAN manager hash for your password, and it's just a additional layer of security. So my recommendation is always 15 or more character passwords for any account. Longer the better. Another item to touch on is Active Directory security. I already touched on this with the trusts. If you don't need a two-way trust, you only need a one-way trust, just do a one-way trust. Yeah, it can be a little more work, but it's also it's more secure to do a one-way trust versus a two-way trust. It's always recommended to do the minimum, whether that be permissions or anything else. if you are using your managed AD as like a user store and you plan on doing LDAP calls to it, highly recommend that you enable LDAP over SSL. Currently, what that requires you to do is deploy a PKI solution and Microsoft Enterprise PKI solution. We actually have, I don't think the link's here, but if you're interested in it, we actually have what is called an AWS Quick Start, which can automate the deployment of PKI for you. You can choose a one tier or two tier PKI deployment, and it'll deploy the CAs and set everything up for you. You don't. It's basically almost one click. You basically point to the AD, point it to some credentials, and choose the VPC you want it in, and it'll take care of everything for you. And we also have a blog post that describes how to do that as well. If possible, it's recommended to implement multi-factor authentication, whether that you could do that natively with smart cards, YubiKeys, or whatever you want with your AD users. Multi-factor is generally a good idea, especially for elevated accounts. I've worked in places where my regular account, yeah, I just had my normal username and password, but my admin account, I had to log in with a smart card for multi-factor, multiple factor. So I highly recommend doing multi-factor, especially for privileged accounts, because those could be the keys to the kingdom, as some people say. Out of the box, there is some confusion about the VPC security group out of the box. It is 0.0.0.0/0, and that does cause some concern. And in a way, it's not opening your managed AD up to the internet, so it's not really insecure. Because you can't add an elastic IP to your managed AD ENIs that are in your VPC, so there is no way for it to be public. But what it does allow is allow anything within the VPC to communicate with the managed AD. That may or may not be appropriate. If that's not what you need, you can tighten that down even further to certain CIDR blocks or IP ranges, and only allow that communication. The lower the blast radius, the better for everything. Also, another thing to keep in mind is where you place your managed AD and Active Directory, even on EC2. Whoever has full admin into an account can take snapshots. They can change security group rules, change network ACLs, change routes. So they could cause you pain. They have the ability to take a snapshot of an AD, which you may or may not want. So keep in mind where you're placing the managed AD and who actually has full access to the AWS account that it resides in. Less said, some of the items we touched on are flexible deployment options, a variety of patterns that we use to deploy managed AD, whether that be in using it as a standalone managed AD or integrating it with another on-premise AD via a trust. We talked about some of the ways you can secure your AD, and also talked about trust relationships with the AD as well, and some of those myths. And we also talked about some recommended security practices. We're going to be around after this as well, and if you have any feedback or anything you'd like to talk more about, I'm also here for the next 2 days, so I'm available if you want to set up a meeting, set up some one-on-one time to dive deeper, because I know this is a 200 level session, so sometimes the depth might not be where you want it to be. So if you want to go deeper, I'm happy to do that with you. And these are the links that will be in the slide deck once it's available to you. It's kind of self-explanatory there. The very bottom one is the blog I was talking about with Trust. It goes into details and has that diagram that's actually in the slide deck as well. The hybrid DNS on Active Directory, that's using Route 53 with your AD, using Out 53 resolvers with it. That's a really interesting read, and I've used that one with a lot of customers, and it's actually a recommended approach to use Route 53 resolvers and create resolver rules to forward DNS traffic to where it belongs. And then you can just point everything to the VPC's .2, which is the .NET resolver for the VPC. With that said, I want to say thank you for your time, and we appreciate you being here. And like I said, if you have any questions, we'll be available afterwards. And my email address is in there, and Dennis's Twitter account's there as well. Feel free to reach out. And please complete the survey. Thank you.